name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. If indeed there is anything to that supposed Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, we are truly cursed. As you undoubtedly know, mass killings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, have given leftists exactly the excuse they needed to push their preordained agenda to incrementally end the private ownership of firearms in America. And the roar for gun control has been very loud indeed, up to and including actor Matthew McConaughey doing an Oscar-worthy performance from the White House podium, as he choked up and tearfully recounted the victims of his native town, Uvalde. McConaughey also coined a new phrase to camouflage gun control you will undoubtedly hear many times in the future. That is gun responsibility. Now, unfortunately, we are now seeing even Fox News adopt the legacy media narrative as Brett Baier gave McConaughey a soapbox for gun control on the network, and multiple Fox anchors regurgitated the lie that we've had over 200 mass killings in the U.S. since the beginning of 2022. Now, we'll talk about that later in the show because news sources are now routinely quoting propaganda from a website calling itself the Gun Violence Archive. And I can assure you that what they classify as mass shootings are not just active shooter scenarios. The vast majority of these cases they cite are gang-related killings, typically not even in public places, but instead in apartments and gang-related parties or other gatherings. And unfortunately, even Republicans are now regurgitating the phrase invented by gun ban advocates, namely gun violence, a phrase designed to imply that death by gun is somehow worse than death by stabbing or bludgeoning or improvised explosive device. As I explained to a staffer from Senator Thom Tillis, who used that phrase extensively in a letter to constituents, there is nothing unique about death by gun. Death is death. And if gun ban advocates were truly interested in benefiting society rather than promoting their preordained disarmament agenda, they would be working to stop all types of violence. Unsurprisingly, the U.S. House, under Speaker Nancy Pelosi, on Wednesday passed H.R. 7910, the misnamed Protect Our Kids Act, sponsored by New York Democrat Jerry Nadler. The bill raises the minimum age to 21 for possessing any centerfire semi-automatic rifle or shotgun capable of accepting a magazine with a capacity of more than 5 rounds, adds redundant language against straw purchases with the intent of gun trafficking, requires serial numbers on all privately made firearms, mandates that defensive firearms be locked up if the home contains a minor or any other person ineligible to own firearms, codifies the current ban on bump stocks, and bans ownership of any magazine or ammunition feeding device unless the device is owned prior to the date of enactment of legislation. And by the way, that's magazines or ammunition feeding devices of more than 10 rounds, meaning that existing magazines could not be sold or otherwise transferred. H.R. 7910 passed in a largely party line vote of 223 to 204, with 5 Republicans defecting to vote for the measure. I'm happy to say that all Republicans in the North Carolina delegation to Congress voted against the bill. But it does go without saying that all the Democrats in the North Carolina delegation voted for the bill. Now that's the bad news. The good news is that many, if not most, of the provisions are not expected to pass the 60 votes required for cloture in the Senate. However, that does not mean that nothing will pass the Senate. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has now tasked 2 Senate Republicans with negotiating with perennial gun ban advocate Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. The items that seem to be the most frequently mentioned are raising the age for semi-auto possession to 21, universal gun registration, aka universal background checks, and red flag gun confiscation orders. And bear in mind that these items present the low-hanging fruit. If the Democrats get them, they will use the momentum created to immediately come back for more. And who are the Republicans negotiating with the devil? Well, one is John Cornyn of Texas, and the other is our own Senator Thom Tillis. Remember, compromise, as our opposition defines it, is a process under which we might lose less than under their original proposal, but we still lose. So grab a pen, because there are senators to contact, and tell that. And tell them that you will not tolerate compromise on gun control. You will tolerate no compromise on gun control. First, call Senator Thom Tillis at 202-224-6342. Again, that's 202-224-6342. 202-224-6342. Next, I'm going to need you to go to our home page at grnc.org. Again, grnc.org. At the top of the home page, you will see a big old red stop sign. Click on that, and it will take you to a legislative alert with the other U.S. senators to contact, how to contact them, and what to tell them. The idea of GRNC legislative alerts is that they let busy people make their voices heard to legislators in just a couple of minutes. Again, that's grnc.org, grnc.org. If you didn't get those, grab a pen for the next break, because I will repeat them. Now, we're going to talk more about federal gun control in the next segment, but that's enough bad news for right now. Now, some good news. You may recall that GRNC and Gun Owners of America have been suing sheriffs over obstructionism in issuing North Carolina pistol purchase permits and concealed handgun permits. Last year, we sued Wake County Sheriff Gerald Baker twice. The first time when he stopped issuing permits altogether during the pandemic, and the second time when he continued to slow walk both purchase permits and concealed handgun permit. I'm happy to say Baker is now under a consent order to comply with the law and paid us most of $30,000 for his malfeasance. So next we move to Mecklenburg County, where yet another urban leftist sheriff, Gary McFadden, was taking a year or more to issue purchase permits and concealed handgun permits. Well, last month we won a preliminary injunction against McFadden, requiring that he too stop slow-walking permits. Well, this week we made that victory permanent with a consent order filed in Superior Court, which requires McFadden, 1, to process North Carolina pistol purchase permit applications within the 14 calendar days required by law, and issue permits to qualified applicants immediately as required under GS 14-404F. 2, to take fingerprints on the same day that a concealed handgun applicant presents at the sheriff's office for fingerprinting, rather than setting up appointments that were running 6 months to a year. 3, to make all requests for mental health records for concealed handgun applicants within 10 calendar days of receiving the application as required by GS 14-415.15a. 4, to issue or deny concealed handgun permit applications within 45 calendar days and receipt of mental health records as required also by 14-415a. And it further enjoins McFadden from otherwise violating state law with respect to issuing pistol purchase permits and concealed handgun permits. Now, we are asking North Carolinians to monitor Mecklenburg and Wake counties for compliance with the law regarding handgun permits. Incidentally, we have also received complaints in Buncombe and Guilford counties, so if you experience firsthand problems there or elsewhere, use the contact form at grnc.org to let us know. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. Grab a pen because after the break, we're going to tell you how you can stop federal gun control. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. As we discussed before the break, Nancy Pelosi's House of Representatives just passed their wish list for gun control in H.R. 7910. The vote was largely along party lines, and I'm happy to say that all North Carolina Republicans voted against gun control. The big question will be what happens in the Senate. Although it is widely conjectured that the Senate won't pass the House proposals, that doesn't mean the Senate won't pass anything. And in fact, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has tasked two Senate Republicans, with negotiating a, God help us, compromise with anti-gun Democrat Chris Murphy of Connecticut. And one of the Republicans doing the negotiating is our own Senator Thom Tillis. So I need you to contact some senators and tell them no compromise on gun control. Ready? First, call Senator Thom Tillis at 202-224-6342. Again, 202-224-6342. Next, I need you to go to our homepage at grnc.org, grnc.org. At the top of the homepage, you will see a big old red stop sign. Click on that, and it will take you to a legislative alert with other U.S. senators to contact, how to contact them, and what to say. The idea of GRNC legislative alerts is to let busy people make their voices heard to legislators in just a couple of minutes. Again, grnc.org. Notice that I said no compromise on gun control. Unsurprisingly, even some conservatives have been questioning whether, in light of recent events, we shouldn't accept some sort of compromise. In fact, two conservative think tanks have recently put out articles saying that conservatives should get behind what leftists like to call universal background checks and red flag gun confiscation laws. So now I would like to relay my piece, which just ran in Carolina Journal, a publication of the John Locke Foundation. It is entitled, Why Conservatives Should Not, quote, compromise on, quote, reasonable gun control. And here it is. Given recent tragedies, some conservatives say universal background checks, or UBCs, and red flag gun confiscation orders, or GCOs, aren't really so bad, and perhaps we should compromise. Ignoring momentarily that neither measure would prevent mass killings, since most involve gang killings, not active shooter scenarios, and that their inevitable failure will have gun ban advocates clamoring for still more, let's examine these so-called reasonable proposals. Universal registration, for example. Anyone claiming that the Computerized National Instant Background Check System, or NICS, can't be used for gun registration should know that it already has. After Congress passed the 1993 Brady Act, its initial 5-day waiting period sunsetted with the 1998 launch of NICS, transaction records for which must be expunged by law within 72 hours. However, Attorney General Janet Reno kept the records indefinitely, citing audit purposes. When the NRA sued Reno for violating the Brady Act and the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act by creating de facto gun registration, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, including then-Judge Merrick Garland, disagreed, saying in part it wasn't a registry because it didn't cover all records. Now, Attorney General John Ashcroft later destroyed the records in 2001. NICS, like the Federal Form 4473 created by the 1968 Gun Control Act, applies only to sales by licensed dealers, not transfers between private individuals. To create a proper gun registry, however, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or BATFE, needs to capture records for private transfers, which explains demands for universal background checks processed through NICS. And I assure you, creating an illegal gun registry is exactly what BATFE is doing. In November, Gun Owners of America, GOA, obtained leaked documents revealing that in 2021, BATFE grabbed 54.8 million records, leading 51 congressional Republicans, including our own Representatives Ted Budd and Madison Cawthorn, to send BATFE a Freedom of Information, or FOIA, request. In its reply to the FOIA request, BATFE admitted having 920,664,765 records, with 865,787,086 records digitized. That's nearly 1 billion records, or triple the 285 million records BATFE possessed in 2016. Now, understand, BATF is allowed to gather records from gun dealers only when the dealers go out of business, and even then, only records covering the last 20 years. You see, dealers were allowed to destroy Form 4473's after 20 years, at least until BATFE recently required that they be retained permanently. Gee, I wonder why they want that. And how did BATFE get all those records? Well, a gun dealer recently told me he accessed from the NICS website the record for a background check done 6 months earlier, suggesting that NICS transactions are again being illegally retained. 41 congressional Republicans have filed H.R. 6945, the No Registry Rights Act, co-sponsored by our own Representatives Dan Bishop, Ted Budd, Madison Cawthorn, and Richard Hudson. Unfortunately, under Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the bill will never see a hearing. So, those proposing we compromise by accepting universal background checks would give more transaction records to an out-of-control agency already amassing an illegal national gun registry. Does that sound reasonable to you? And what's wrong with registration, you ask? Well, ask the New York State residents who registered semi-automatic firearms and later received letters offering the opportunity to turn them in, render them inoperable, transfer them out of state, or go to jail. Registration is the necessary prelude to confiscation. Now, on to gun confiscation orders. Under red flag GCOs, family members, spouses, dating partners, vindictive exes, or in some states even gun-hating co-workers can declare you dangerous. In ex parte or emergency court hearings, you might not even know about, denying you a defense in court. Congressional testimony by the Independence Institute's David Kopel suggests that about 1/3 of GCOs are eventually reversed because they never should have been issued in the first place. Why? Because a more equitable GCO model, formulated by the Uniform Law Commission, was blocked by gun control groups demanding laws with flimsy and unreliable procedures for ex parte orders, virtually guaranteeing that GCOs are issued against the innocent. GOA lawyer Mike Hammond once told me that, out of caution, and I quote, most judges would issue a GCO to a ham sandwich. Getting one reversed could take years and thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, a 2019 study of GCOs by the Crime Prevention Research Center's Dr. John Lott found, and I quote, no significant effect on murder, suicide, the number of people killed in mass public shootings, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary. Consider, too, the risks of confiscating guns from people who don't know a GCO has been issued, such as Gary J. Willis, the 61-year-old black man in Ferndale, Maryland, who prudently answered a loud pounding on his door at 5:17 a.m. with gun in hand and was shot dead by police. Now on to the path forward. First, we should call BS on claims of 200-plus mass killings in 2022 by the often cited Gun Violence Archive. The majority are neither active shooter events nor in public places, instead reflecting gang violence. Second, tell leftists that it is their policies that have produced the recent explosion of all types of violence, gun-related or not. Policies like no bail release, refusal to apply sentencing enhancements, defunding and otherwise demoralizing law enforcement agencies with phony claims of systemic racism, and exacerbating racial tensions. Finally, tell them it's their denigration of the nuclear family and American values that's creating violence-prone sociopaths. Until we address those factors, until we get the courage to address those factors, we can deter school shootings only by adopting the security model used in airports, including arming trained volunteer teachers, similarly to the Department of Homeland Security's Federal Flight Deck Officer Armed Pilot Program. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. After the break, we will return with more information better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Also, allow me, if you will, a moment of shameless self-promotion. I have just written a book called Rules for Anti-Radicals, a Practical Handbook for Defeating Leftism. You can obtain this book at rulesforantiradicals.com or on amazon.com, and it will teach you how to deal with leftists in daily life and how to stop them from bludgeoning you into compliance and silencing you. Anyways, in our last segment, I spoke about how mainstream Americans should refuse what is billed as compromise on gun control. Now, let's look at what purports to be compromise. This from longtime Congressman David Price. Understand that Price has voted for every gun ban that has ever come before him, and that it is Price's wife, Lisa, who started the group originally known as North Carolinians for Gun Control, until they had eventually decided that it was more marketable to call themselves North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. So last week, Congressman Price wrote an op-ed for the Raleigh News and Observer entitled, "I'm Ready to Compromise with Republicans on Guns." Well, first he starts tugging at the old heartstring by listing school shootings and saying, and I quote, "The Republican Party has hardened its collective heart in the face of repeated tragedies, determined to maintain the support and avoid the wrath of the gun lobby." That's you, by the way, the gun lobby, the disembodied merchants of death working for evil gun manufacturers, when in reality the truth is exactly the opposite. We are the grassroots, and it is the leftist billionaires who hire professional lobbyists to terminate our rights behind the facade of what they want you to believe is a grassroots movement. The political term of art for that, by the way, is astroturfing, as in phony grass without grassroots. Anyway, Price then goes on to describe how such a compromise would work, saying, and I quote, Common sense gun reforms like universal background checks, red flag laws that allow weapons to be removed from threatening individuals, and restrictions on high-capacity magazines and military-grade weapons may not stop every mass shooting in the country, but they can significantly improve the odds. Taking weapons of mass killing off the streets decreased gun violence in the decade after 1994. That, by the way, is a lie also. The 1994 so-called assault weapon ban that sunsetted in 2004, even the ATF admits that it had no impact on crime. In other words, the usual litany of gun bans that the left calls for more or less continuously. But wait, there's more. He goes on to say, I recognize that I may support more restrictive gun control measures than some of my conservative colleagues may like. But I'm prepared to compromise if they are. I call on them now. Put your ideas on the table. Ideas for keeping guns out of the wrong hands and taking military-grade weapons out of circulation. Put your ideas on the table and then let's talk. Let's negotiate. Let's do our jobs. Well, that's it, folks. That's how compromise works for the left. They come to the table with a full list of the freedoms they want to take, and then they offer you a chance to negotiate a deal in which they take only some of those freedoms, at least for now. But in no case do you ever benefit from what purports to be compromise. Again, compromise, as your opposition defines it, is a process under which you might lose less than under their original proposal, but you still lose. And what they don't get this time, I can assure you they will be back for very soon indeed. This is straight Saul Alinsky stuff, folks, right out of Rules for Radicals, where Alinsky said, and I quote, to the organizer, that's the community organizer, compromise is a key and beautiful word. It is always present in the pragmatics of operation. If you start with nothing, demand 100%, then compromise for 30%. You're 30% ahead. Yeah, he's 30% ahead, and you're 30% behind. Welcome to compromise as the left defines it. Now, let's take a look at one of the guys doing the compromising. That would be our own Senator Thom Tillis, who is tasked by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, along with Texas Senator John Cornyn, to negotiate with Democrats on gun control. Let's listen to Tillis in his own words, in a video he made for the News and Observer.
We're actually looking at a framework that includes 4 key pillars. One are background checks. Today, if you're 18 years old, none of your prior history is accounted for. It's as if you're a day old when you go in and you apply for a gun or a gun permit. What we're trying to do is look into the juvenile record and see if there's anything in there that's particularly concerning. Maybe an offense you were convicted of when you were a minor that if you had done it when you were over 18 years old would have been disqualifying. So that's the first pillar, making sure that our background check system has complete data on the applicant. The next pillar is on mental health, and in fact, it's probably the most important pillar, making sure that we have the behavioral health, mental health resources available nationwide for people who are in crisis to get the care they need and take a lot of the pressure off of a system today that is simply not providing the mental health resources that we need across the country. One of the things that we're trying to accomplish is to identify someone who's at risk and someone who may possess a gun. We don't want a federal so-called red flag law, but there are states that have done extraordinary work in this area. Florida is probably the best example. A bipartisan bill passed that's had over 5,000 cases run through it that provides due process on the front end so that it's not about confiscating a gun because someone's expressed a concern. It's about going through a legal process and giving the person who may have to have their guns taken for a period of time get the opportunity to have their day in court, and on the back end to also restore and return those guns if the threat no longer exists. That's a but it's also very important to say that the federal government is going to encourage states to consider these laws, but at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the state legislatures and the governors to determine whether or not they want to implement them. And then the final piece And a very important pillar is school safety. After Columbine, there was a significant amount of money and attention focused on high schools, but we now know that elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools need additional resources. They need additional training so that we can make sure that our children are as safe as they can possibly be.
All of that sounds pretty reasonable, don't you think? Tillis isn't calling for universal background checks, just improving background checks by opening up sealed juvenile records, which of course will create thousands of new people who are permanently barred from possessing firearms because of some adolescent indiscretion, but never mind that. And of course, who could possibly oppose increasing school safety, whatever that means? Then we have Tillis's second pillar, namely improved mental health care. Now, the devil's in the details there. It might be something as benign as providing counseling for people who seek it out, but on the other end of the scale, never forget that the Soviets used to relegate political dissidents to psychiatric wards. But on the third negotiating point, notice that we have lost that pillar metaphor. Tillis doesn't want a federal red flag law. Oh, heavens no. And he will only agree to a red flag law if you get due process. But folks, I'm here to tell you that all due process is not created equal. Right now in North Carolina, a vindictive ex can get a domestic restraining order, they call that a 50B order, in an ex parte or emergency hearing you don't even know is taking place, much less do you get a chance to provide your side of the story in court. And once that 50B order is issued, the first time you might hear about it is when the sheriff shows up to serve the order and confiscate your guns. And that's right now, even before instituting a much lower burden of proof in red flag gun confiscation orders under which a wide variety of people can get you declared dangerous. That's the kind of due process that Uncle Tom Tillis is proposing for us. Due process in which first your guns are confiscated, and then, at some future date, you might get a day in court. Look at Florida, says Tillis. A wonderful model for us. Okay, Uncle Tom, let's do that. Let's look at Florida and see how well that Florida law is working. But first, we need to take a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. After a short break, we will return to take a look at that Florida model that Uncle Tom Tillis is proposing for us. My name is Paul Vallone. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Before the break, we heard Senator Thom Tillis describe how the bipartisan so-called gun reforms he's working on having been tasked by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to negotiate a compromise with Democrats. While most of it may seem at face value as to be relatively benign, Tillis is advocating legislation encouraging, which probably means forcing, states to adopt red flag gun confiscation laws modeled after the one Florida adopted in the wake of the Parkland killings. On the upside, under Florida's gun confiscation order, or GCO law, only law enforcement can apply for the order, not your vindictive ex or, as in California, anybody, be they a gun-hating coworker or a stalker who wants to disarm you. That said, any of those people could approach law enforcement and ask them for a GCO. Now, on the downside, the due process you are afforded means you get your guns confiscated first, and then, at some future date, you get to present your case in court. So, how's that law working in Florida? Well, let's start with the website from the Florida law firm Katz & Phillips, and a piece entitled, and I quote, "Florida's red flag law is discriminatory and being abused." which describes how in its first 2 years of existence it was used more than 3,500 times. Now I guess it's up to 5,000 times. How it discriminates against the poor because, as civil law, you are not entitled to a court-appointed counsel. That means if you can't afford a lawyer, you don't get to defend yourself. Then it goes on to say, quote, the act is obviously being abused. While some counties in Florida might never have never sought a risk protection order, others have sought one for every 850 residents in the county. The statewide average is one order per 5,500 residents. When the statewide average is one RPO for every 5,500 residents, and your county has a rate 6.5 times the average, something is wrong. Residents of Highlands County, for example, are 35 times more likely to have an RPO issued against them. Translated, that means if you live in a leftist county, watch out, baby, because they're coming for your guns. Then it goes on to describe how the law is being applied to people forced to use firearms in self-defense, specifically citing one client forced to draw his firearm in response to a road rage incident in which he was threatened with a baseball bat. But when the police couldn't find the bat at the crime scene, they saddled the client with a gun confiscation order until such time as he managed to find a surveillance video from a nearby business to corroborate his account. Elsewhere, a Florida news station reports that in one county, 100 orders, fully 25% of gun confiscation orders issued, are being issued to children as young as 8 years old. That's right, gun confiscation orders are being issued against children too young to own guns. So what Senator Thom Tillis has in mind for us is a law under which a gun confiscation order can be issued against you without your knowledge on a flimsy pretext that could cost you thousands of dollars and years to reverse. Once again, got a pen? Call Senator Thom Tillis at 202-224-6342. 202-224-6342. Then go to our homepage at grnc.org and take 3 minutes to make your voice heard. And that the message to deliver is no to gun confiscation orders. No compromise. Again, grnc.org. In other news, the voice of tolerance was heard again this week when Nicholas John Roski, age 26, of Simi Valley, California, by his own admission, attempted to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. I call them the voice of tolerance because that's what they claim to be. The voice demanding that we not only tolerate different cultures, ethnicities, sexual orientations, bizarre gender pronouns, and socialist beliefs and practices, but to embrace them. In fact, the left demands tolerance of everything except viewpoint. Because if you deviate from the left's accepted orthodoxy, however absurd it may be it the fantasy that men can get pregnant, or that men can fairly compete in women's sports after claiming to be women, or that abortion should be available on demand anytime, any place. If you fail to comply with any of these leftist orthodoxies, they will destroy you. In fact, they will kill you. Of course, that a pro-abortion leftist would attempt to kill a conservative justice was utterly predictable. So predictable, in fact, that the resounding silence by not only Attorney General Merrick Garland, but also Joe Biden himself, as pro-abortion leftists first doxed the conservative justices, and then set about intimidating them by loud, obnoxious protests at the homes of those justices, as violent rhetoric and death threats were directed at those justices, just as the Department of Homeland Security predicts rioting if the court actually overturns Roe v. Wade. In fact, that a left-wing nutjob would try to kill a conservative Supreme Court justice was so predictable that I would argue that in some quarters it was not only predictable, but intended. Let's face it, if leftists kill a justice, Uncle Joe leftist, gets to appoint his or her replacement. What we are seeing is effectively court packing by assassination. Nor is the violence by the self-proclaimed voice of tolerance by any means unusual. It is, in fact, the norm. When a criminal named George Floyd was killed by police, the result was nationwide rioting and arson in which numerous ordinary citizens were killed. 574 riots, in fact. In fact, when any black criminal is shot by police, no matter how justified the use of deadly force, we are treated to still more rioting and arson and looting. And when an undoubtedly leftist Supreme Court clerk decided to damage the judiciary by leaking the draft version overturning Roe v. Wade, let the vandalizing of pro-gun pregnancy crisis centers and pro-life organizations begin, up to and including, of course, trying to burn them down. Or last month, when a reporter for Rewire News Group called for more violence against pro-life Americans over the weekend as she celebrated reports of vandalism against the headquarters of a pro-life group in Wisconsin. In a now-deleted tweet, Carolyn Riley said, and I quote, "More of this. May these people never know a moment of peace or safety until they rot in the ground." And we aren't just talking about abortion. Increasing violence is being perpetrated by far-left activists like, how about James Hodgkinson, the Bernie Sanders supporter who shot House Minority Whip Steve Scalise as he tried to kill congressional Republican colleagues at their baseball practice. From the Weather Underground bombings to firebomb-throwing Antifites to BLM leaders threatening to burn it all down, it is the left which is perpetuating violence and terrorism. So, what's Speaker Nancy Pelosi doing about it? Why, holding a prime-time kangaroo court-style hearing on the insurrection on January 6th, in which the only two people killed were apparently nonviolent protesters killed by police. So what's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer doing about it? Why, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court and issuing physical threats to the conservative justices, of course. And what's Attorney General Merrick Garland doing about it? Why, sticking the FBI on parents who are fed up with their children being indoctrinated by critical race theory in schools, even calling those parents domestic violent extremists. And, of course, what is Joe Biden doing about it? Well, he's exacerbating racial tension by calling everybody white supremacists and encouraging illegal protests outside Supreme Court justices' homes. As always, it is a standard tactic to accuse you of precisely what they are doing. So, the next time you hear somebody say, well, the rhetoric on both sides is getting a little too heated, I want you to say, nonsense. The true domestic violent extremists are almost always on the left, and that is where we need to focus our law enforcement efforts. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network, BigTalker.live, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop at HyattGuns.com. You can also check out my website at GunsPoliticsAndFreedom.com, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of the show. See you next week.